This is Senate Government Operations. It took us a little time to get ourselves organized, not because of the photo, but because of me. So here we are now, and it is Wednesday, April 27th. I always look to Senator Collmore to hold up his fingers, tell me what the day is. So we are going to be looking at H512. And I think we have both as passed by the House and as introduced. And as introduced, we know was a problem for many people. As passed by the House is still a problem for many people. And I think what I would like to do is start with the Secretary of State's office to talk to us about the necessity of this bill, why it's important to pass this year, because I know that you feel that way. So I'd like to hear why it's important to pass, and is it important to pass the entire bill, or are there sections that are important to pass? So I don't see Chris here, but I see both Tanya and Lauren, and I'm not sure who wants to start.
I think we're going to start with Tanya, if that's okay.
Okay, that's just fine. Thank you. Tanya, would you like to join us?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, this is Tanya Marshall. I am the Chief Records Officer and State Archivist and Director of the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration and Secretary of State's Office. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Would you like me to talk about the bill as passed? Or you would like me to talk about why it's important for this year, because that's where Lauren and I would tag team between the two. And I would probably defer perhaps to start talking about the importance of the Verlona and then how it does intersect directly with the Yapura. So what would you...
I think it's the most important. We haven't had a walkthrough of the bill, so we know, and we have heard a number of people testify on as passed by the House. So I guess what we need to hear is why it's important for this to pass this year, what it does, what it doesn't do, what it hopes to do.
Sure. So I'm probably going to pivot back and forth between the Office of Professional Regulation and also the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. In terms of the bill that's in front of you, it's very realistic and logical. With my colleagues in the Office of Professional Regulation, it's really started with looking at what was happening on the notary component and the revision that was happening with the uniform law. And this is related to the federal act that is coming down that we expect to have passed. We have been monitoring that as a Secretary of State, as other Secretary of States have been monitoring this legislation for the last year. COVID really turned over the aspects of having to move into a more electronic realm at a faster pace, which we've heard in terms of a lot of testimony on particular acts. Right now, for the most part, the federal government doesn't also recognize that there might be some states that haven't enacted certain legislation. And that's what we've been monitoring. So we work together on the Verlona section and have been doing so. Where it overlaps with the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, which may not be as obvious, is that we authenticate documents for foreign use. So when an individual has a Vermont public record that they want to have used legally in other countries, it has to go through Secretary of State's office for an authentication process. And that is also true for notarized documents. So that goes through the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. So we've been monitoring this legislation in particular around our abilities for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration in terms of notarized documents and the authentication process. And then the Office of Professional Regulation has been monitoring the related Notarial Acts changes and the federal laws because of their role with professional licensing. So I think if you're comfortable with this, Madam Chair, I will pivot over to Lauren Hibbert to at least discuss that aspect of it.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Lauren Hibbert, Director of the Office of Professional Regulation. Ms. Marshall's completely right. We have been wanting to work through Verlona. We have been planning to put it into an OPR bill or have it as a standalone bill starting in either House GovOps or Senate GovOps. And then we saw that H512 came out, and this was our vehicle to move the ball forward. We really think it's essential. We have had emergency notary rules in effect very soon after COVID came to Vermont. We moved forward on those emergency rules. We've renewed them, I think now 3 times. We would like to not renew them again. The discussion on H512 has been really understandably focused on land records, but I just want to remind the committee that notarization of documents is not only particular to land records. It's quite a bit more. It's wills, it's adoption, foster care, court depositions, a lot of bank documents. It's everywhere. So it's essential for us to move this forward. And it will really set us up for the federal legislation, which we are anticipating. As Tanya Marshall said, we're one of the states that doesn't have this in place, but the federal legislation thinks that we do. So we really need to get this in place so that we're prepared for the federal legislation. We also, when we took on Notaries Public, we have rulemaking authority, as we do for all of our professions. We are behind in our rulemaking, I would say at this point, but we're behind for an intentional reason. We're behind because we wanted to get Rolona in place, this newer version, so that we would be able to not have to go through the rulemaking process twice. And then COVID was a complicating factor, of course, and the emergency rules went into effect. So we really, we would be able to move notaries further down, in the stream of modernization with this bill being passed. And this bill does some important things. It has the endorsement for remote notarization. It raises the fees for notaries right now. We do not think that the notary program is funding itself appropriately into the advisor pool fund, and it would have the endorsement. So, we recognize that not all notaries will want the remote endorsement, but this does open the door for that possibility, in addition to preparing us for the Secure Act. So for those reasons, we strongly support passing the Rolona sections of the bill. But again, that's very closely tied to your PURA. And with that, I'll turn it over again to Tanya. But the 2 uniform laws are very closely intertwined with each other. And it makes sense to move them together. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Tanya.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask a question that both of you can answer as you're going through this, perhaps. I know that you talked about the sections that deal with Bologna and with, what's the other? And that isn't Bologna, it's Bologna, right?
Bologna.
That was a joke, Lauren, Bologna.
We got it.
Okay. And
Well, I just got a panic that I said it wrong, so.
No. And the other section, the UETA. So when you talk about those sections, if you would help us remember which sections of the bill are important to that, to those 2.
Okay, I'll have to look at the bill. I don't have the bill in front of me, so I don't know which section it is, but I'll find that out.
They're the second half of the bill. Aren't they the second half of the bill?
Well, I just need to know, because if we're looking at, because it's a 26-page bill, and if they all relate to those 2 or sections of it relate to those 2, we need to know
It's
what we're talking about here.
It's the later half of the bill, but I'll find the specific sections.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, and I'll let you know.
Okay, thanks.
And
So,
Madam Chair, I'm sorry.
No, Tanya, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's section 5 for the part that's specifically related to the revised uniform law related to notarial acts. That's section 5. Related to where it's intersecting with the electronic recording components and why they do go together and so tightly is that all other states except for the state of Vermont has enabled its town clerks to actually move into electronic records. If you read Title 24 and you look at the recording laws that we have for the state of Vermont related to land records, they are very antiquated and they're very paper-based. We're the only state that still has that legislation. I put in, Lauren and I have written testimony from the Secretary of State's office that was posted. If you look at that, all other states have enabled their town clerks to actually move into electronic records. So some of the testimony that you received or heard related to different points of online access and so forth, from a compliance standpoint, if you read Title 24, it is very old language. And we talked about the Vital Records Act when we did that reform a couple of years ago. That was one of the areas that's still very paper-based. So what YPURA does is, one, it enables the town clerks for the first time to actually move forward. It doesn't force anything to happen at a very high level. The problem is that right now, of not enacting these two together, is that all other states have already done this. And there is a graph in that written testimony that will show, if you look at the map that's at the end of that, Vermont has a big 0% in terms of digital records for land and also e-recording. And all the other states, including those surround, usually have most of their populations, almost 100%, being served by electronic records in terms of land records. So right now, I've been watching this uniform legislation I was hired by the state of Vermont in 2003. This uniform law was passed in 2004. We did, as a state, the legislature asked the Agency of Administration in 2004 to look at having an enterprise-wide kind of system and moving forward to electronic, because other states had already done preliminary legislation before the uniform law came in. And I actually have all the RFPs sitting behind me, and there was a lot of recommendation. It was early. So 2004 was very early for people to move into electronic records. So we're kind of in some ways behind, but we're also in some ways in a very good position to do that. So the reason why they do go together is that this federal legislation is going to enable the force of going into electronic records. And we are the only state standing out right now that has not enabled its town clerks to actually move into electronic. And what's nice about YPURA is that it's an overlay law. So it doesn't require you to actually go as a legislature and rewrite Title 24 right now. It enables us to start working towards that electronic records recording, and it allows us to start working with the clerks on a very specific new mandate that they have not had. Title 24 requires paper books. Title 24 requires that the legal copy that people review and access is the paper copy. This overlay law enables the work that needs to happen. And at a federal level, the assumption is all other states have already done this. So Vermont's a little bit behind there, but in some ways I think we can be more advanced because we have more tools available to us to get that done. So that's why they go together. That it just really stands out. We have not enabled our town clerks to move forward. I think they're in a very good position to do that. But this is where it stands right now, is that the Title 24 is very much paper-based.
Senator Coleman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tanya, you said Section 5. Section 5 of the bill is the effective date. So
sorry, Section 4 then. In terms of
Okay.
you're talking about
Section 5 is on page 8.
It's notaries public is where section 5 starts. On the bottom of page 8. And it,
okay.
Are you looking at as introduced or is that
As passed, Section 5, effective date.
as passed by the House?
Yep,
Are you on the right bill?
I believe so.
Huh.
Okay, anyway.
Wait,
You're right.
You're right, there are two
exactly.
sections 5.
There are two sections 5.
I was trying to find it.
Page 8.
All right.
Yeah, section 5 starts on the bottom of
Yeah,
page
I
8,
got it
and then
now.
I
Okay.
think the effective date should be section 6,
Okay,
right?
makes
Oh.
sense.
Yeah.
we were both right.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? I hadn't noticed.
Okay, so the whole first part is the UETA, and then the second part is the Bologna.
But, yeah,
Am I
Rule.
right about that? Or-
Section 1, Madam Chair, is the findings and intent, and we agree
Yeah.
with that. Especially the way that this is laid out right now, that it says it's the preliminary first steps, and that has to do with the fact that, we are one of the last states to enable even the notaries to move forward. That has been, that we're doing a revision for the 2021, which just came out in August, but the new notary laws were fairly recent. We are the last state for your purpose. So section 1 is the findings. And then section 2 moves into the uniform law. There have been very minor changes on this, and I can talk about what the intention of the Uniform Law Commission is and having drafted this. The changes that were here, we're adding the definition of recorder. We have 2 areas in law where a town clerk is mainly the recorder, but there's sections for county clerks as well. So that was changed or added. And then what it has in here related to the standards and best practices. Right now, there is not a requirement in terms of standards and best practices outside of what is outlined within Title 24 for indexing and other things of that nature. When we move for any state, the way that the Uniform Law Commission has recommended this is that you use an existing standards body to do that work. And we are that within the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. I'm happy to talk about where Title 3-117 outlines this. It's a natural thing for us to do. We are already working with town clerks on different levels. This would enable us to now help them move into electronic components for that. So that is the end of section 2. The only other change was under standards and best practices. And I do want to point out here, and I know it came up with discussion where it says shall. When the legislature did Act 100 in 2018, this was a update to the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration's statutes. It also looked at the management of public records in the Public Records Act. Some entities have a may. So unless you're a part of the executive branch, you may work with the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, but it was a very hard may coming out of the House and Senate government operations committees. This one is a shall for the town clerks to work with us. They already do. So that's not a difficult, and I know Carol is here to talk about that. This is the one pivotal point that I see in this is that this is now doing that direct correlation for those uniform standards and best practices. And we absolutely would want that at a state level for electronic recording, electronic records and land records. It's now become so standardized across the country that this actually allows them to come to us for the standards, which we are empowered to issue as well.
Thank you.
Tanya.
Yeah, Tanya, I'm sorry. Which shall and may, are you on page 6 with all these shalls and mays?
Yeah, so page 6 in the bottom where it says standards and best practices.
Oh, okay, that.
Yeah, so Uniform Law Commission highly recommends, and this is why this uniform law was put through when it did in 2004. They already had some states beginning to enable electronic records and electronic recording, and there were some concerns about how that would be implemented when you have multiple, elected officials in a state. So it was very strong on needing uniformity, which means everyone's using the same standards. Everyone's using the same best practices. You've heard a lot of testimony about that there aren't standards and best practices across, the recording right now. This would actually put that together. And that would come through the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, which is what you've empowered us to do. All our requirements for us issuing standards, it requires us to use industry standards and best practices. There is an industry, the Property Records Industry Association, which is a government and business sector that has representation from recorders. It has representation from all the national associations that are represented around your witness group. They have issued standards and best practices for the last 20 years. It's become very refined. So I have no concerns about this particular section, and we didn't hear any concerns about the clerks on how that's worded as well. So that is that would be 27 VSA 625 on the bottom of page 6, which is section 2 of the bill.
Right. Anthony, yes. So if we make progress, I don't think that the objection to the bill was in the latter sections, where we're in the Rulona sections. They were all in the sections 2 and 3 and 4, I believe. Is that correct? Andy Michael and Peter Tucker and I think assume Jim Knapp's concerns are at the beginning of the bill, right?
Well, it's their concerns that
Land
the concerns that they expressed
Right.
weren't directly related fully to the bill. It was more about different concerns that they have about their interactions with town clerks and the availability of records.
There was that. I
Yes.
agree. But I think they're wanting to move us. I think one of their concerns was they want to move us faster into electronic notarization and electronic recording. And what I guess I'm just, you guys, I think our chair had charged you guys with going away and coming back with some work that we could agree that the two different parties could agree to. Is that my understanding?
Everyone agreed when we met in 2020 that YPURA should be passed. That was the recommendation, and we've had it in there. There's nothing controversial about YPURA at all. It's enabling the town clerks to move into electronic realm for the first time with standards and best practices. Yes.
Right. And so what's your timeline, Tanya, on the expectation that we're going to get them up to speed? What's the expectation that they'll all be up to speed by when?
So that's the difference of what the timeline, and this is where it gets into the section, the following section talks about when we met with the House, they asked us what we would be doing underneath the statewide records and information management program, which is what our statute is to enable this. We have towns that are using different systems right now. They're not using them for electronic recording. So we will be working with each town to understand where they're situated. The other part that we had asked for, and that has a cross-reference in there, it is section, let me just get that for you, is section 3 on page 7. This is us reporting underneath the statewide records and information management program. This is not a task force or summer study committee. This is just us reporting on what we do already with towns, but they would be scoped on this particular activity. We had asked about fiscal components. You know, there's a lot of what would be the cost to this, what would this look like, and how are towns individually supported financially. Right now, land records are covered underneath a fee bill. However, it's unclear or unknown whether or not those fees actually cover what it costs to do their current land records, let alone move into another realm for that. We had suggested a joint fiscal office for that particular part of it. And then learned that the joint fiscal office can't be charged directly to write a report. So we agreed to have it in there and has us consulting with them. So we are able to collect that information from the towns because they do receive different forms of funding. So that gets into this fiscal sustainability to move forward. The other part that we'd be looking at is their operations. Some of them have different support systems that they receive internally. Some of them don't. They're independently within that office, within that town. So we have a reporting function to come back in January and provide the legislature with some more objective information related to each town clerk's office, which is what we intend to do on that. And in terms of your asking when this could be enabled, we have current systems that may or may not be able to move forward. I don't know the answers to those systems yet, but they're also under contract with the town. So we have to work through that to understand, and we'll be able to come back in January and tell you more about that. We do have, and you had heard testimony about a centralized system or so forth. I have been actually working with our state procurement. Those are all possible things that we could look at in terms of an RFP for that. It's enabled within our statutes to also look for enterprise-wide systems that are compliant for that part. So I think Senator Clarkson asked your question. There's a couple different things. Electronic notarization is going to require OPR also working through rules so people can be endorsed to do that work. So that's going to take a while as well. That gives us enough time to also look at what is happening within the town clerk's offices and what they can do to enable should they want to go forward with electronic records and electronic
not
recording.
Should they want to, we need them to.
Yeah, and we will have this. I think we're in a good position as a state. I can't answer the question on time frame because we also have a number of towns using other systems right now, and we still have to vet how they look in terms of electronic recording and what their contracts look like for those. So if they're in a system that can't do electronic recording, but they still have 2 years on that contract, I think that's important information for the General Assembly to know. and we would be able to provide that in January. That's just one of the examples.
But you could go, we could go ahead without all the town clerks on board?
Yeah, this is, so as an overlay law, it does a couple different things. One, it allows the Title 24 rewrite to not have to happen right away. Right now in this current legislation, and it says May. So essentially, once a town clerk shows that they want to move forward, then that they have to work with standards. So we're prepared to issue the standards as early as January, but we have 100 towns that have systems already. So it's unclear whether or not those systems will actually be able to move forward with electronic records and electronic recording. We would know pretty soon as we start working with them. But right now it's just a May, and then the legislature can come back and think about in the fall. Yes.
So, you want to go first?
Well, if I could.
Yeah.
I guess,
I'm really frustrated by this.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm confused as well. I thought, as Senator Clarkson pointed out, when we last looked at this, that the bankers and OPR and the Secretary of State's office and whoever else was involved with this, the lawyers, we're going to get together and look at 512 and say, okay, we don't need to do this, we don't need to do that. Here's what we really need to do.
Yeah.
And pare the bill back. So I'm in receipt of something from the Vermont Bankers Association that is asking us, and I think everybody on the committee got it, they want to expand the study committee to include a banker, realtor, and lawyer. They do not want us to pass the uniform laws until the 2023 session. At least that's what they will recommend, but rather let the study group do its work. But if that doesn't work, pass H512 with the uniform language, but push out the effective date until 2024. So it doesn't sound like you all got together.
Nope, it doesn't.
So if I may, I don't think that we understood that to be something that we were supposed to be doing in the interim between the last hearing and this hearing. And if that's our failing, then I own that because I could have organized that. But that wasn't what we understood we were doing before the last hearing and the hearing that was scheduled last week, but then ultimately was canceled. So
Okay.
I think that was our understanding, because you guys are miles apart in terms of the timeframes. I believe I heard from the lawyers, the bankers, there didn't need to be another study. Everybody felt it was.
Senator Clarkson,
ready to go.
if I may, there is no study committee in this bill. And I think that's where some of the testimony that you've received is very confusing, because it's actually hasn't been based on the bill itself. The uniform law related to electronic recording is very straightforward. It enables clerks to move into electronic realm. They do not have that authority right now in the way that the Title 24 is written. In terms of enacting date, the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration is charged with making sure that clerks comply with, well, any public agency is compliance with its current laws. Its current laws are paper-based laws, and we work with town clerks based on the laws as written. I wouldn't postpone doing your PURA, because this is the first enabling statute that you have to allow clerks to look at seriously electronic records and electronic recording. And the way that this is written is allows that the standards body, which is the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, to actually set the standards and get that ball rolling, which is what is in section 1 as the intent.
Right.
And I think that's where the confusion is, that the section of us writing a report on our work with town clerks between, if you pass 512 and January, is us reporting what we're doing underneath our statewide records and information management program, which is already part of statute. We already do this work. On occasion, prior to COVID, we were testifying on the outcome of that particular program. We have all the capabilities underneath our current statutes to work directly with the clerks the same way that we work with all other public agencies on this. I think there's a lot of confusion because it stated it was misconstrued as a task force. Our constituents underneath the statewide records and information management program are public agencies. We have about 7 to 8 different public agencies in our target assistance program to receive assistance with new legislation, with going forward with new systems, going through with the records management programs. If you enact YPURA, that enables us to start working directly with the towns with the actual charge to start looking at electronic records and electronic recording. Underneath their current laws, it's paper-based. And so I think there was a lot of confusion with some of the testimony that you received on that, because YPURA enables the ball to start rolling. Don't enact YPURA, there is no ball rolling on electronic records and electronic recording for town clerks. My recommendation would be to keep these together, because these two things right now, as a state, we are the only state that has not enabled our clerks to move in this direction.
No, we're way behind. It's clear.
And I think not, I guess this is, I don't understand the position of saying have to wait, because able for us to work with clerks and be able to provide you with a lot more information about what directions you might want to take on some of the other testimony that you did hear. I need to be able to empowered to help them, and they have to have the legislation to move forward. And January is not that many months away to give the legislature a lot of information that helps you decide what you want to do moving forward and how you want to proceed based on the testimony that you received from the other witnesses.
I'm no less confused.
Yeah, I don't know whether it makes sense to hear from
The only-
Chris and Chuck. And
I was gonna say maybe Chris and Carol Dawes.
yep, okay.
I don't think Carol is here. I don't think she could make it today.
She's
Yeah,
on.
she's here.
Oh, she says, it
Okay,
says
good.
she's here.
Excellent.
Let's hear from Carol, and then I'll down
And
go to
Jim,
Chris.
and we haven't heard from Jim Knapp yet either, so it would be good.
So further confuse us, Carol. What's your take on where we're at?
I understand the committee's frustration. For the record, Carol Dawes, Berry City Clerk and Treasurer and Chair of the Vermont Municipal Clerk and Treasurers Association Legislative Committee. I understand the committee's confusion. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that there had been a charge to meet together and try to come up with some unified language. I agree with everything that Tanya has said. That we've that the 512 as was approved by the House is the best approach at this point in time. It's incremental, but incremental in a good way. It moves us forward with the overlay language that we need to begin working more deeply to lay the base works associated with moving into electronic recordings. It allows for the support person in at VSARA that will work with clerks. It allows that position to research what systems are being used by clerks around the state and to look at ways to perhaps do a state contract or contracts working with the vendors that are already in the state. And the most important thing is that it really understands the fact that you can't paint all the clerks with one brush. We are 250 approximately individual offices, and that's not a bad thing. The 250 offices are there because we're 250 distinct towns with very different needs and assets and priorities, and that the clerks in each of those towns have to work within the parameters within their communities for financing, for staffing, for technology, and that all of those things need to come into play during these discussions, and that the report to come out of VSARA would bring all those bits and pieces together.
So what do you see as some of the excuse me, biggest challenges facing you and the clerks? What stands in the way? Anything?
Well, and as I mentioned, the available funding is always a challenge. Reluctance on the parts of select boards to either move technology forward or to invest in either the more robust internet connections if they're available, or in the programming, the contracts necessary to move into being able to have digitized documentation and the programs that would be able to accept electronic recordings. Funding to staff offices, the ability to attract staff. There are a number of different issues. An office like mine, we have a system in place. The system we have will accept electronic recordings. We will be able to transition into that quite easily when UPERA is adopted. And many offices are like that, but certainly a lot of the smaller towns don't have those luxuries.
Sure.
So, Carol, my understanding, at least from the lawyers, realtors, and bankers, is that they need us to move a little more quickly on this, and that they need us to be able, that the digitization work needs to go further faster, that there's no requirement in here for towns to accept an electronic record at the moment. And if they can't accept it, and if they still have problems indexing these records, property owners are frustrated. So I guess that's why I asked for a timeline, and I guess that's where we needed some work out between that group of people and the clerks. And I guess I'm puzzled. There seems to be like a vast amount of infrastructure money to pay for some of this. We've paid for the last 2 years to modernize our records, which we, through in economic development, have put money into the modernization of planning and municipal records. I don't know how we ever got this far behind the 8 ball. And anyway,
Senator Clarkson, if I may just comment on some of that, is that I think there's a lot of different terminology happening related. So there's some different asks that you've heard from the business side. There in this bill, it does enable the acceptance of electronic records. That is what UPERA does. It enables the electronic recording. So that is it's fully electronic. These are system to system transactions. So if you can picture a situation right now, which is what the current law is the records come in paper format, they're mailed or delivered, then someone has to convert them, right? If they were going to try to make them accessible online or record them, but they're still doing paper-based. You're talking about a recording process that's very lengthy. This law actually enables things that could go down to minutes or hours to do timely recording and have it available shortly thereafter. So it is electronic to electronic. So this is what UPERA is doing. It also allows that something comes in paper to convert it to digital. Right now, when there's a conversion to digital, there's lack of standards and so forth, because it's not really expected. The realm of what recording is right now is paper-based recording. So I think there's some terminology there. The funding that you did for the CARES funding, we had advised a certain way for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, and the group, that group did work together, and that group chose the path forward, but it was about retrospective. It's about recorded documents that had already been recorded and converting them. This bill, as enacted, will allow the electronic, so everything that's already electronic, to move electronically, and then allows also for more time later to do back file conversion, which is what we call it. But there's two different things that were funded. It wasn't a modernization program. That was a back file conversion for access purposes, but that's not electronic recording. So when you ask about the timeline for this, we have to make sure that, and that's what Section 1, which is the findings of the General Assembly that was put in through the House, was that we have to look for fiscal stability, We don't know what that looks like right now, and we're very grateful that the Joint Fiscal Office will be doing that work and looking and reporting back. The other thing we have to look at is operational sustainability. So if we're looking at moving all the town clerks into a certain realm, how are they going to operate? And that's individually understanding, which is Carol laid out. They have different support systems. Where does the state maybe have to come into support system? We're seeing that, I am actually seeing that as the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. There's a lot of need for different supports to municipalities for different levels. We don't know what that looks like fully for the town clerks. And then it gets into governance. How do we want to govern this component? So this right now is laying the groundwork for that, but this is electronic recording. This is the Modernization Act. It is your PURA.
We're really gonna have to hear from every town clerk, right? Because there'll be differences. It's almost like 200 and something different pieces.
Well, that's what Tanya's proposing to do, right? Isn't it?
That's what we're proposing. We will go, we plan to go visit with every single town clerk and work directly with them to understand their circumstances, which is what Carol has kind of expressed. We have a fee structure right now that's not really sustainable for a certain, there's a lot of different supports that are happening. When we first talked about this and a couple of years ago, I was looking at, there's interlocal agreements, for example. So in other states, Iowa is a good example. The Iowa recorders kind of came together. They used their interlocal agreements to kind of come together with a same system, and they did that in 2004. Our interlocal agreement legislation is select boards. Select boards can come together. Town clerks can't necessarily. So there's a lot of different factors of how we want to look at this. And what we're asking for is when you enable your PURA with Verlona, because these things are already moving together, and this is, it goes with the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act, which the state did pass. These things all move together. It's going to allow us quickly to come up to speed of understanding where we need to be at a state, and then be able to report back in January and make recommendations to the General Assembly. And then this gives you opportunity to decide how you want to proceed in a couple of different fronts. But this way you have more objective information. You have real information from the towns.
Lauren, you had your hand up a couple minutes ago. I don't know if you still have your hand up, Lauren.
I did. I just wanted to go back to why I think there's this, why the question about time is relevant. And, you know, you're looking at the as introduced versus as passed bills. And I think it's just important to put out on the table that the as introduced bill would have set up an entirely new division in the Secretary of State's office to oversee how town clerks do land records. And it's really a hammer approach to push the timeline forward. And I understand the urgency and the frustration. And this is a group of people that have been working on these issues for 25 years in various stakeholder groups and various, you know, assortments of people, but it's been the same people working on this issue. But because of the complexity, because of how many town clerks there is, the Secretary of State doesn't believe that the hammer approach, the creation of a new division in the Secretary of State's office, is the correct approach. We think the carrot approach, incentivizing UPURA, which is a huge move forward for the town clerks. I mean, you heard Carol say she's ready to do it and she's set up. She's also, you know, from a large town and able and has the resources to do that. Not every town is in the same position. And if we incentivize it and provide the structural support, which frankly towns haven't had from the Secretary of State's office through this position, this creation of a position of FSR, and through an informed report of where towns are and what the limitations are on them fiscally, from an IT perspective, from a staffing perspective. I mean, it's a complex issue. I think we would be able to move it faster ultimately than the as introduced bill that would have created a new division. I mean, the report back from Tanya's team in January, you'll have that in January, setting up a new division in the Secretary of State's office that on a bill that's effective in July, and we have to set up a whole new division. We're not going to get very far by January, and I can guarantee it. And
we're building bureaucracy. You wouldn't necessarily get the results you want, but you spend time building a bureaucracy essentially.
Yeah, it would be a bureaucracy building time. And maybe that's what's required. I don't know, but what I know is that what I firmly believe is that we'll get further down the path if we have more information and understand what the obstacles are for town.
Understand what the challenges are. So I think everybody has the same goal, which is that in a uniform fashion, we record, we index, we notarize in a uniform fashion electronically, and have the opportunity to do it both electronically and in a paper, to have all the options in front of us, but that it all be done in a uniform fashion. And you're proposing incentivizing and bringing people along. That's the chief difference between the as introduced bill and your approach, which is encompassed in this second bill.
And
And I think the important thing is the as introduced bill replicated essential functions that are currently housed in Visara as well. So it would have created a new division in the Secretary of State that had substantial overlap with Visara. So it didn't build Visara's capacity. It started to undermine it in a one way of reading it, and replicate it. And so what the Secretary of State's approach is let's put this more firmly in Visara's responsibility through the creation of this position, through the position supporting the town clerks in a very clear, articulated way in the statutes. And then we'll come back with a report. And in January, we would have a robust conversation about the progress that Visara's made and where the town clerks are, and probably be back at this conversation of what's our next step. But at this point, the step in the as introduced bill, I don't want to speak for Carol and her association, but I think it would have alienated the town clerks and not incentivized them to come forward.
Talk about making progress by January. So there'd be a report by January.
Yes.
Would there be other kinds of progress made between now and January, or would we be relying on the report back? Really?
So I can answer some of that, and this is my concern with the push that was something has to happen by a certain period of time. Everything that we do is disciplined, right? We have to work through all the different requirements, understand what path we're moving on. The bill is introduced actually created bifurcation of the record keeping, which is the Senate and GovOps committees worked really hard. House GovOps worked really hard to end bifurcation. And that was when you created the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. When we're talking about what we've heard, wanting a new system, wanting a statewide system, you would receive feedback from other people who actually do have land records in addition to what the town clerks have. So keep in mind that it was a very narrowly scoped testimony. If we're talking about standing up even a statewide system related to land, the state of Vermont also has land related records that people would very much advocate to be part of a larger system and larger framework. I think in terms of progress, we're really going to be walking through exactly where the town clerks sit, what they're positioned to do, what their capabilities are, what their support systems are. It's a disciplined approach that hasn't yet been done to really understand. And this is what we do. I work with all the agencies and departments. When they get new legislation or they find out that there's some change, we work through all their different support systems from a fiscal standpoint, from an operations standpoint. This is what this bill is enabling. I don't know. We may have some clerks, as Carol said, her particular system is set up. And we did ask them to make sure if they're standing up systems after the CARES Act to make sure that they're compliant with your PURA. I don't know what their contracts look like to really walk through that. So, you don't want to rush electronic record. You don't want to rush a pivotal point. You want to get the well-disciplined and organized. Think about all the state systems that you hear about and all the testimony that you receive about different initiatives. It's something that does not happen in 7 months. So that's my concern, is a lot of it was, let's make sure something's actually in place by January, and even procurement doesn't go that fast for something. And yet we don't even have all the requirements in place.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that I was expecting more progress by January.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure that we're sort of thinking about it the same way.
I think we are hoping for more. I mean, Tanya will know more. I mean, there will be progress by January.
Right, we'll know a lot more, and then we can walk through and provide, so some of the questions that came up was, whether something need to be restructured in government. I don't think anyone has those particular answers right now. You received testimony about what was proposed to maybe be restructured, but I don't have the answers, and I'd rather have the General Assembly have really objective information, because when you look at a local level government, where have we done different changes? So we've had this state's attorneys and sheriff's department, a good example of a state department that provides services, right, to local government, but hasn't changed that aspect of it. There's so many different forms of testimony that you could have received if you wanted to look at the different parsing of issues. Right now, I have to focus on the record parts of it. And right now we have a very antiquated land records law. We have an excellent position to move to electronic records. We're probably most well positioned than any other state. I work directly with recorders in other states through my more national association roles. We're in a really good position, and this should have been a positive bill. And that's why it's so surprising to me that it wasn't perceived as a positive direction forward. And I think you've heard testimony that there's maybe Public Records Act violations by people not being open at certain time. That gets dealt with and addressed through different dialogue. You've heard testimony about need for a centralized system. We approach centralized systems as a state with much more testimony and understanding and collaboration at a bigger front than just a very narrow scope on the. So that's my concern. And this gives us the opportunity, if you pass this overlay law makes so much difference, and it really enables the state to move. And I think we're known very well for electronic records management in the state of Vermont. And I know a lot of people may not know that as well, but we're really well positioned to do well. But I do want the General Assembly to have the best information to decide what pathway you want to take forward, whether it's a centralized land system, and if it's broader than just recording of land records by town clerks. If you want to look at a restructure, what kind of supports need to be put in place, not only for town clerks, but you have local law enforcement, you have others that do need support. What kind of structure would you like to do for that? You didn't receive testimony as a General Assembly on those other factors. It's been very narrow scoped on just land records and just town clerks.
Carol, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to just add that one of the other deliverables that's in this bill is work on uniform standards and best practices, and that is definitely something that we've already started working on, and would be produced as part of this bill. We're going to do it anyway because it does need to be done. So that is happening.
Senator Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I think I understand the Secretary of State's position, but obviously there's not agreement here. So I really want to hear from Chris Delia and Chuck and Jim Knapp and Andy, and again, for the benefit of our chair who came back, I was under the impression that they were all going to get together and come up with a kind of a solution for us, and I think Senator Clarkson helped, and they haven't. So we're still kind of.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure that I was under that impression. I was under the impression that the opponents of the bill think it doesn't go far enough and that it doesn't do enough. And the proponents of the bill felt that it starts us in the direction that allows them to go farther.
Right.
And that the opponents wanted everything in the bill right now instead of.
Okay.
So that was my understanding.
We understood that too, but I think Brian and I both thought that you had sent them off to the cafeteria to work further on this together. But I guess we were.
Well, we were going to go to Chris next. So it's okay. Chris Delia.
Thank you, folks. For the record, Chris Delia, President, Vermont Bankers Association. I guess I would agree with Lauren and Tanya and Carol, I was not under that impression that we were told to go to the cafeteria. So my apologies for not doing that.
Maybe Senator Clarkson and I were supposed to go to the cafeteria. I don't know.
That's where we're being sent now.
We did ask.
At this point, I'm ready to go to a bar. I'd like to step back for a second, and I'd like us to consider the fact that a uniform law to move us in the direction of electronic recording, sure, it would be nice to finally have that on the books in Vermont and get that process moving forward. Having a modernized statute on uniform notarial acts would be nice to have on the books to move forward. But I have been doing this long enough that I know when you're in the context of legislative discussions over the years, you only get so many bites at the apple. And my concern, in part, is that we don't make progress because, quite honestly, I lack confidence that we will actually follow through and develop standards, that we will actually implement some of the things that are proposed to, my words, study in the bill. I truly lack that confidence. And I don't want to be here a year or 2 or 3 from now with the potential of saying, well, we passed those bills a few years ago and not much has changed. I want to go back to something that Carol talked about, the individual nature of 250 plus towns in the state of Vermont, each being unique in their approach, makeup, support, whatever it may be. And does the electronic recording piece make sense? Is it important for those communities who want to move forward, who would have to work with the Secretary of State's office in Visara? That's great. My town may not be ready for that. Many other towns may not be ready for that because of any number of circumstances. Yet tomorrow, we're going to send a town a document or documents for recording. And in some towns, those will be indexed and recorded properly in a paper-based format, which we will not move away from magically overnight. There'll be an extended transition period with paper-based and electronic, but some will index and record properly, or in certain ways, and others will not. I fail to see the difficulty of putting towns in a position of having to follow a clear set of standards at some point in the near future for indexing and recording documents in a paper-based format. I fail to see the problem with that. Because right now we have some great towns and we have towns who, for any number of reasons, do it differently. There's no standardization out there. To have a document not indexed properly so it's uniformity out there, to have documents be put in a box in a town clerk's office for recording at a later date just doesn't work for the marketplace. So set aside the whole discussion of a separate land records commission, et cetera, as the bill was introduced. Okay, let's set that aside for right now and focus on the bill that passed the House. Great on electronic recording. Not all are going to get there. So what happens in those towns that still work on a paper-based system? Because Senator Clarkson, you are absolutely correct. We want those towns to move in an electronic direction. There's nothing that's going to force them to do that because some towns may not be able to. So that's where the frustration comes in from my point of view, from the point of view of the institutions that I represent. We want to make sure that when we're going to lend in the marketplace, we have a good title opinion to look at, and that when we submit a document for recording to perfect a lien on a piece of property that has a mortgage on it, that it's going to get recorded properly, and that the position of the financial institution is going to be protected in a paper-based system that we have today. So I hear what Tanya and I hear what Lauren and Carol are saying. I just lack the confidence that we are going to effectively get there in a timely fashion, because not everybody is going to electronic. And I'll stop there.
Sure, got this quick question.
Yeah. Oh, no.
I appreciate what you're saying, Chris, but I'm not sure what you want us to do. Like,
Well, I think my document was straightforward this morning, or my email was straightforward. And I'll refer to the 2 points in the document. Number one, I think there's other representatives that need to be part of that study or review collection report that's going to be submitted back to the legislature. You don't have practitioners there who are in the land records or utilizing the land records, and I think they could help to inform that discussion of what they see in a variety of different towns. So having a banker, having a realtor, having a lawyer, and quite honestly, at this point, as I pointed out in that email, having a member of the House and a member of the Senate join that process to, and I don't want to use the word referee, but at least to be a less passionate, impartial player in those discussions of developing the report. The second piece is, I guess, Senator Polina is, again, I go back to my concern about my concern about the appetite to continue these discussions going forward when you lose the opportunity for leverage in the legislative process. I don't want to sit here and a legislative body say to us, well, we passed that last year, Chris. We already took care of the issues last year. We did not take care of the issues. We did not address in a paper-based format indexing and recording. So that's why I suggested either not including them in the bill this year, or if you choose to include them in the bill, to keep the pressure on by not allowing them to go into effect until such point that you see, at very least, the interim study, but perhaps the full study. So that's why I wrote the email the way I did.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm willing to hand power over back to you.
So Chris, I understand that. I'm not sure that, I'm not sure why delaying a date on except on adopting the uniform standards would I would think that putting the date in there earlier to adopt them would help in that transition. And I also wonder on page 6, it says under standards and practices, it says shall use the resources of Visara, and maybe we are more forceful in saying that the towns need to give them some sticks and carrots and to adopt them. But because I know that we faced the same issues in law enforcement in this committee over the years, and in terms of them reporting how they're reporting things so that it's uniformly reported. And we now have 71 out of 73 agencies using the standard reporting. So it does happen. And that was because we kept on and because we gave them both sticks and carrots. So
Madam Chair, the shall, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'll be happy to be wrong. The shall relates to moving forward with an electronic recording process. That's where they would engage with Visara. That's great. What about the towns that don't?
So Chris,
excuse me, Tanya, there's no shall, as far as I can tell, there's no shall for a town that does not engage in electronic recording. There's no shall to follow standards or best practices.
Okay, so you're saying that we really need to have the shall in there, that they have to work with Visara on coming up with the standards and practices around electronic recording.
Regardless of whether it's paper-based or electronic.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I think Tanya had her hand up.
Sure, thank you, Madam Chair. I mean, I agree with Mr. Daly. I think the concern that I think everyone has, if there's standards out there, and there have been standards out there, some clerks, for whatever reason, aren't following them, right? I mean, that's part of it. You know, I think can be language, anything that we issue at this point, this uniformity underneath this law is actually going to be based on electronic indices. I mean, that is what the clerks are enabled to do electronic. It's the only part that's there. Where I disagree with Mr. Delia is that, you know, we don't walk away from this. This has actually been a law that I've been waiting to have on the books to be able to do this. And I think the clerks have been waiting, you know, it may not be universal. We do receive a lot of calls from clerks who cannot move into electronic recording because they're too small. We have this problem. And I have already been working with procurement, and that's part of the process. We will be putting forward some type of RFP on behalf of those towns for that type of enabling. They're just too small to do it. What I'd like to see is that we collaborate together because we're working all towards the same goal. And the town clerks are there too, but we also have to parse out when we see a situation, and I'm not the policing entity for it. I'm there for the record keeping parts, and we can provide that support. This position enables us to actually be right with the clerks. We'll be able to understand and get them moving on good uniform practices. But I'm not the policing. And I think that's been some of the question, is to say, what happens when you may have an individual, and this is all public officials, this is all public agencies, when you have someone who's not maybe complying with the expectation, and there is no central entity to go to like there are for other entities. And I think that's the hard part that everybody, I think that's the question that has been sitting in that room. If someone goes through and they see a town not recording or having documents just laying around, even with the best standards and best practices, who do you go to get that resolved? And I think that's really what everyone has on their minds for some of these questions.
And I don't know what the answer to that is. Does anybody have a suggestion about what the answer is? We have 251 independently elected or appointed town clerks, just as we do select boards and planning commissions, and unless we want to have a centralized, and that's a bigger conversation about taking the recording away from the towns. That's a huge conversation. So I'm not sure that we're ready to go there. So I don't know. Who do you?
Madam Chair, nobody's asking for that. To be clear, nobody's asking for that. The centralized system still very much honored the Constitution, which would require that documents get recorded at the local level. I'll go to what Tanya just said. It is frustrating when you have 250 towns, and just pick a number. You have 150 doing it differently, or whatever that number is. And to me, it's, if we have standards in place, that we need to address that very question that was raised. Who is going to be overseeing a town in their administration of indexing and recording of land records? If we could solve that, I think a lot of the concerns start to fade away, because then we see that we're moving in a positive direction for those documents at the local level. But that's a third rail nobody wants to touch.
Well, is that something that we solve now, or is that something we put in the study committee when we add members to the study committee? And one of the questions in there would be who is going to be the enforcer?
Senator White, if I may, it's not a study committee that's in the current bill. That's not what the House Commerce asked us. They asked us to report on our work with our constituents. So underneath the statewide records and information management program, our constituents are public agencies and departments. So I was asked if I could report on the statewide records and information management program, which we're always happy to do, but it's not a study committee. And that's my concern, is that if you want a study committee, we don't have the capacity to do a study committee and then do what we're trying to do in this bill.
No,
and I don't want to mediate kind of that role. I really want to be able to focus my staff and our time on the actual record keeping components and understanding the town clerk situation too. So I just want to be clear, it's not a study committee, it's not a task force. It was really designed for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration to report back. It has a cross-reference to 2 associations because all our work with local government, we work through those associations because it is our only entity to get collaboration, to kind of work through a collaborative body rather than going to 254 whatever different jurisdictions. We're able to kind of collaborate through those associations. So I had asked for them to be cross-referenced when we were asked, but it's not a study committee and it's not a task force. We've had a lot of those. This is really just us focusing on the town clerk's particular situations and reporting back to you.
I apologize for that. When Chris was testifying, I wrote down, expand the study committee and add a House and Senate member. So I apologize.
I just want to clarify that's that part of the bill. That's what we're reporting on the statewide records and information management program. It's not to say that you couldn't do a studies committee, but I'd like to focus our staff and time on the standards and moving forward.
No, but he did say that. So that's why I said that, because, and he said it in his note to us also.
Right.
Expand the study committee.
Right. And there isn't one.
And there isn't
while
one.
you were out of the room.
Oh,
Right.
okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear.
No, it's
I
okay.
wasn't here when you said that.
We missed you, but wait,
Okay,
we
sorry.
did hear that.
And I would add a key part to this is that it does allocate a full-time position. And I did mention we're already working with recorders in other states and deputy recorders to find a really qualified component. I have a lot of colleagues that I work with through associations. They've been able to bring on electronic records within a very short period of time within very large counties that are much larger than the state of Vermont. They don't have the challenges that we have with the separate recorders, but they certainly have their own unique challenges. And, I have full faith in our capabilities. I completely understand that we would be issuing out standards and us working with these towns. They're going to be getting the standards for their current paper-based records as well. But we really would want to be developing those electronic record standards because our goal would be that for those towns that can't support their own system, that there will be something available through statewide contracting. And I've been meeting with procurement. The key part is the requirements. And then that would be the decision more of the General Assembly about how you would want to proceed with that. Would you want it to be something different as a statewide system that's broader, or would you want that to be that the towns are enabled to take advantage of statewide contracting for lower costs because the transaction costs for some of these towns are just too high to do their own systems? And we don't have the advantage of interlocal agreements the same way because they are run through the select boards and town clerks can't take advantage of that particular legislation right now.
So where are we on Senator Polino? While I was out, I guess you did a lot of, I'm still confused about why, Chris, why you think that passing the first two, passing what's here around the uniform will actually impede the conversation and slow it down. And so putting off maybe I completely misunderstood that because it was talked about when I was out, but I am confused about that, about delaying the effective date. What would that do? Why that suggestion?
I put it on the table, Madam Chair, merely as leverage to make sure that the standards in a paper-based system were developed and implemented.
Oh, I see.
That's sort of what they-
I just, as I say, I lack the confidence that we develop something for electronic. We have a lot of towns that don't go in the electronic direction, and we still have problems with indexing and recording in those towns going forward. Be sitting here 5 or 10 years from now, still talking about problems with indexing and
Got it.
recording.
Okay. Thank you. I did not understand that. Chris, Chuck, did you have a?
Well, Madam Chair, I'd actually like you to hear from Jim Knapp, but if I could just say briefly, and this kind of echoes what Chris Delia just said, enacting UPURE now would be like owning a 1920 Model T and reconfiguring your dashboard so that you might be able to put a Bluetooth-enabled stereo system on it. And I would say that the emphasis should be on upgrading that Model T to at least a 2020 vehicle before you worry about the Bluetooth stereo being on it.
Okay.
That's really what it comes down to, is that this is just enabling electronic recording on a system that is not capable of doing it on a thematic basis. And Tanya will do a good job in getting some towns going on that, but there's a fundamental underlying problem with the paper-based system, not only as a paper-based system, but also getting those paper records digitized, which is not electronic records, and getting them accessible on a comprehensive and thematic basis. So it's just sort of layering one more thing on top of an already antiquated system. And with that, I'll stop talking, and I really would urge you to hear from Mr. Knapp if there's time.
Yeah, I think we will, but I'm wondering if you can't buy the Bluetooth speaker while you're upgrading the Model T.
Yeah, I don't know, getting into all the analogies here. I think that's I think you got to get the horse before the cart. There's just this fundamental flaw in the system, and it's not the clerk's fault. It's the result of the fact that we have a town-based recording system, and there needs to be a centralized state authority that can give plenty of carrots, but also has to have a stick. And it doesn't have to be a whole new bureaucracy. It could be Vivsara, but Vivsara doesn't want to do that. And we're saying somebody needs to do it, and they're the logical ones. And it has to be soup to nuts, right to the bottom of the system. The whole, the paper-based system needs to be overhauled in the form of better indexing practices and some enforcement authority. And there's this pride factor associated with that issue that, I'm sorry, I don't buy it. These are public records, and they need to be run properly, and there needs to be accountability if they're not.
Okay, Mr. Knapp. And Lauren, is that a hand up in your corner, or is that something on the wall behind you?
It's something on the wall.
Yeah, it's not her hand.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right,
Ready for
Jim?
me?
Yep.
Good afternoon. For the record, James Knapp. I'm the co-chair of the real estate section of the Vermont Bar Association. And I'm going to put the spoiler first and then explain my reasoning. I've submitted some written testimony for you to review. I'm going to try not to read it to you, but in an effort to keep it short, here's what we did. 3 times I've put out the proposed bill to the membership of the real estate section. That's 447 real estate lawyers who, for the most part, have no shortage of opinions about any question you ask. I got exactly 4 responses over the course of the entire legislative session for the 3 times that I put this out there, and not one of them is relevant to the bill before you today. I'm not going to talk about the bill as it was introduced. I'm only speaking to the bill as was passed by the House. Having heard no opinions one way or the other on ROLONA, the Revised Uniform Law and Notarial Acts, I have to assume that either no one cares or no one thinks it's a bad idea. I suspect no one thinks it's a bad idea. ROLONA has worked throughout the country. A lot of states use it. A lot of states are doing electronic notaries. Vermont will figure out how to do electronic notaries. I don't know how many real estate lawyers will use them. According to the sense that I've gotten from the discussions I've had, including teaching a couple of seminars on how to actually do electronic notaries, most real estate lawyers are not doing them. They're not using the emergency rules. They're too complex. They're too hard. The requirements are too significant, and the scope is too narrow. The ROLONA bill is going to improve that because it will widen the scope, although the requirements are similar. There are at least a lot of outside companies that support uniform, remote online notaries. I assume that Vermont lawyers will sign up with these outside companies. Vermont lawyers will perform the notary using the remote online notary platform, and things will go along and life will be pretty good. Opera is a different story, and I'm not opposed to Opera, and I don't think the real estate bar is opposed to Opera. I think our concern is this. As we know, we've heard, I don't know how many times, 246 recording jurisdictions in the state of Vermont. God knows how many different ways things are done. I've been doing title searches for 40 years. First thing I do when I walk into any clerk's office is ask them how their system works. Where do they index things? Where do documents that haven't gotten into the records show up? I have a list of 10 questions I ask, and I do this in every single town because I don't want to miss something. That is a high-risk proposition for a client, and missing something because I didn't understand how the clerk did it is challenging. Have I survived? Yes. To date, knocking on wood, I have never been sued for a mistake in a title search. I like to think it's because I'm pretty careful. So we've got a lot of different systems. There's not a single town today that's prepared to actually accept a digital recording. And make no mistake, when you pass this bill with Opera in it, the next day after the effective date, a clerk can start accepting digital records. There's nothing in this bill that says to the clerk, you have to wait until Vasara, the Secretary of State, or someone else tells you how to do it. You can start today. If that's the case, what I suspect will be a few towns will use their existing digital systems to start accepting digital records. Okay, that probably won't be the worst thing in the world, but they'll create some requirements. A digital record submitted has to come in with a cover sheet, and it has to say this, that, and the other thing. And you have to pay for it this way. And the first town that does that, okay, now we've got a standard because one town is doing it. When the second town picks up and says, we're going to do it too, except they use two different systems to do that, now have two sets of requirements for how to submit a digital record. Vasara will be working on their standards. And most of you know, I spent a couple of years in state government, and I know that the state government works exceedingly carefully, but also exceedingly slowly. And we'll have a multiplicity of standards by the time this happens. The bigger issue is this. You're going to have a half a dozen towns accepting digital records. They don't have the in-house information technology systems to do this. What happens to those records that exist only in a digital format when the town gets hit with a ransomware attack? And everyone is denied access to those records and they are unrecoverable. Those land records are gone. You'll have to rebuild the system. There are no standards, and there's no mechanism for creating uniform standards on actually accepting the records, backing the records up, maintaining the records. And yes, that will all happen at some point, but if people get to the point where they're anxious to get it done, or they're under pressure to get it done, I suspect that many of you in the legislature are unaware that there was a push in, I want to say either 2015 or 16 to start putting land records on the blockchain. And a couple of people were actually negotiating with local town clerks about the idea of putting records in the blockchain. There happens to be a deed in South Burlington that is registered in the blockchain.
And we made that possible.
You did indeed, with an excellent bill. I remember spending weeks listening to the testimony in the Senate and the House on that bill. But and excuse me for trying to speak on a policy standpoint, because I'm an individual and I don't make policy, and you do make policy. It doesn't make any sense to me to authorize something for which there is no infrastructure in place. So I'm going to piggyback on something that Mr. Delia said, which is pass Rulona, pass Reparo, but do not let anybody accept a digital document for recording until 2024 or 2025, when the Secretary of State's office, Basara, the clerks, and whoever we create to fix this process of creating standards that every town clerk has to adopt. Not can adopt if they want, not can adopt the pieces they like, but some of it's too hard, so we're not doing that. Everyone has the same standards. Once we've got that in place, let loose the dogs of electronic recording. But
Right.
you have to know that there are big operations outside the state of Vermont that are essentially pushing up against the digital borders of Vermont, expecting that they are going to begin digital recording as soon as the law passes. And that is a really bad idea, if you ask me. And with that, I don't have anything more to say. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
So I just have a question. I'm finally, I think, figuring out what Chris Delia was talking about delaying the implementation date. And my question is it the entire bill? But you said Bologna, nobody had, so do we delay the effective date of section 2, which is actually the UETA?
No.
No.
All you do is add a provision to the bill that says no digital recording until the standards are in place, the town has adopted the standards,
Right.
and
Okay.
is prepared to operate under them.
Right.
I don't happen to agree with Ms. Marshall. I think the state can proceed to build the process without the underlying authority. I don't understand why the policy pieces can't be put together in the absence of a para. But if I'm wrong about that, there's no reason not to introduce, to adopt those provisions of a para today. Just don't let them be effective. Don't let people do digital recording until we're sure we have standards.
Yep, got it.
And the last thing is, I don't understand how someone can say we're going to adopt standards and not let the people whose livelihoods depend on the records be a part of the process.
Okay. Senator Clarkson, did you have something or?
No, I actually, that makes sense, because if we're going to go back to where we were before, if we're going to record, index, and notarize in a uniform way, we want all that work in place and the infrastructure in place before we unleash the floodgates. Is that right? I mean, want to have Tanya set this all up, have the Secretary of State's office do all this work, and then the date of, it's not the enactment date, it's the authorization to digitally record takes place once we have an infrastructure upon which to record it. Is that right?
Well, I think
that's
what
I was going to say. If that's directed at me, yes, that is my view, that it makes sense to have the infrastructure in place, just like you wouldn't put a new computer program on your computer that had never been tested and just start relying on it to run your business. You want somebody to have designed it, carefully thought through the process, tested it, and then you implement it.
Right.
But
so. I'm a little bit. We're a little bit behind ourselves here. I think we got started about close to half an hour late. So my question is, if there was a section in here that delayed any implementation of electronic or digital records until all the standards were set and until there was some ability for enforcement, does that meet the needs here of the people who are opposed to the bill?
Well, first of all, a point of clarification. I'm not opposed to Rolona. I think it's a good idea.
Oh, no, I get that.
But I think that would be a prudent means of proceeding with something that is as critical to the financial welfare of every single person who owns a piece of property in the state of Vermont, including the state of Vermont itself. Not to implement a system, or not to allow people to piecemeal implement a system that is non-standard, untested, and theoretically questionable, if I can use that word, because I can't think of a better one right now. So yes,
Okay. I do see, Andy, your hand up, but what I'm going to say is this is probably the point where we say what Senator Clarkson and Senator Collmore thought we said last time, is that perhaps you would get together with Lauren and Tanya and Carol and come up with language that could be in here that meets everybody's needs, that meets the need to go forward and to accept the standardized, the Uniform Act, but that also says, but with these provisions, you're not going to be able to start just willy-nilly doing it. So that's what you guys thought we were asking for before,
Yeah,
right?
that's exactly what I thought.
Right,
That's what we
so now we are asking for it.
Because that all makes sense.
Right,
But it makes sense to move forward as Tanya has asked and as Lauren has asked. It makes sense to do what Jim has asked, and it really makes sense not to allow something to happen until the infrastructure is set up to allow, that enables it.
and I would say folding in, and I know it's not a study group, but it does say in here in consultation with, and I would say, Chris, get your voice in there about who, in consultation with who. I mean, there needs to be some entity that, from your perspective, that the secretary, the Visara works with around this report.
Yes, Madam Chair. So there is a Vermont Bar Association who could
Okay,
have
right here.
someone.
Yeah,
There is my organization who I could ask a member, or myself, I would participate. I'm sure that we could find somebody from the title community. I don't believe there's a broad title association in Vermont, but we could have somebody from the title community. These are practitioners who use the land documents on a daily basis, who I think could help to inform what goes into the report, at least just their experiences of what goes on with some of the work.
Sure.
so I would ask you to also then work with it, with Tanya to get those voices in there. And
Senator
Tucker-
White, oops, sorry.
Yes,
If I may, it does say interested parties.
I know, but I wanted
okay.
a more specific.
Okay, thank you.
Lauren, did you have your hand up?
I did. I just wanted to know what the timeline was when the committee was planning to take the bill back up. Because it
Well,
will-
we better do it tomorrow. I
Okay.
mean, I hate to put that pressure on you, but we might have as much as 4 days left.
I don't think we'll have it.
I mean, but we really need to get this, because we need to get it out of this committee. If we're going to, we need to get it out of the Senate floor over to the House for them to look at and either concur or not. So it has a long way to go before we get anywhere. And so I would urge that those who are really interested in this bill, and I'm really sorry to do that to you, but, and Tucker is right here and he's been nodding his head all along. So I assume he's willing to help you.
So, gentlemen, if I could
Or he's
just,
falling asleep. Oh, is that what you said, Senator Polina?
I was just thinking out loud.
Okay.
if I could just be a little bit more conversational, what would be helpful to me, since we can't all just leave the committee room, right now and go to the cafeteria, which is what we would do if we were in
Right.
person, is if the people who wanted to participate in the call right after this hearing raised their hands so that I could send an invite to everyone and we could continue the conversation shortly. So,
You got it. It looks like everybody's raising their hand.
well, that's not
How to
helpful.
do
I
it.
need a smaller number. No, just kidding.
I think that we don't need, I'm sorry to say this, but I don't think we need, the Andy and Jim and Chris and Chuck. I think that
Jim and
somebody-
Chris had it.
they all had their hands up.
Yeah,
Sure.
everyone had their hands up. So if we could just have a representative, that'd be helpful.
Right.
Because I think the issues are actually very narrow. So,
Yes,
you know,
I will defer to Jim Knapp.
okay.
Chris, you're welcome to be there. I think you.
I will defer to Jim Knapp.
Okay,
Thank you.
And I'm happy to not be involved as long as Andy is.
so I have Carol, Jim, Andy, Tanya, and myself.
Sounds
All right.
perfect. And do you have all their contact information? They all can send it to you.
Yes, if you guys could send it to me, it's lauren.hibbert, hibbert@vermont.gov. And I
Okay.
will schedule a meeting at 3.
I'll share it with you, Lauren.
Oh, thank you. That's very helpful.
All right.
Terry Corsones came in and out a couple times.
Carrie, did you want to be part of the conversation?
No, I was joining the chorus to say that Jim Knapp is our
Oh.
representative.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I
Thank
see
you, Madam
Andy-
Chair and committee members. Appreciate it.
And Andy, you still have your hand up? Did you still have something to say or were you volunteering?
Well, I was volunteering, but I just want to make sure before we break up, because this group has met before and discussed these issues. So I guess I want to make sure that we understand the charge from the committee that you are sending us to the cafeteria and the woodshed, as is highly appropriate. But before we branch out and start arguing over what the issues are, I'm understanding or asking for clarification for the purpose of this little group, that the issues are H512 as constituted, which are basically Rulona.
No, I don't think that's the whole issue. I think the issue is how do we put something into this bill that actually exists? I don't want you all to start talking about this bill and arguing about it again. How do we put something in here that meets what Chris was saying and what I thought Jim was saying about putting something in here that says you cannot start doing digital and electric, you have to have the standards set first. That's where I think that is the narrow issue that Lauren was talking about.
Yes.
That's it.
And that's both for paper and digitized records, correct?
Yes,
Okay,
Right, but
but that's it.
yes.
we need the infrastructure in place before we start putting anything onto it.
So that's it. We're not going through the rest of the bill. We're not talking about whether we should pass this or not pass this or going back to the original bill.
Thank you for the clarification. Perfect.
I will send an invite shortly. Thank you.
And is that what everybody else understood?
Yes.
What we were asking for? Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, Jim. So bye, Tanya. Thank you.
So I think we're gonna